the existence of Gear 5 doesn't mean that Gear 4 is obsolete now. It is still a very useful ability, and Luffy has recently showcased new ways of using this power, which further solidifies his mastery over it. Luffy has mastered Gear 4 completely, and one can see this form being used more frequently. Against strong enemies, Luffy will likely dive headfirst with Gear 4 techniques being utilized in only a few parts of his body. He'll likely coat it with Armament and Conqueror's Haki. We were worried that Gear 4 would be irrelevant now that Luffy has Gear 5, but clearly, Luffy has devised ways to utilize it against weaker opponents where he doesn't need to overexert himself. And this thing shows just how much Luffy's strength has increased. The point is that in terms of raw strength, Gear 4 is absolutely magnificent and still is one of Luffy's greatest assets. That said, this incredible strength came at a huge price. Gear 4 saw Luffy utilize his Devil Fruit power and Haki at the maximum output, which is why it had a timer. Essentially, Luffy could not maintain Gear 4 for long, and eventually, he always ran out of steam, which is when he was at his weakest. For about 10 minutes, Luffy could not use Haki at all, and that is precisely why he needed to run circles around his enemies or someone else to defend him. Gear 4 had a massive drawback. However, with time, this drawback lessened. Luffy could use Gear 4 for much longer, as seen during his fight against Kaido. Once Luffy learned how to infuse Conqueror's Haki into his Gear 4 attacks, his battle against Kaido was more even. Luffy could freely switch between Gear 4 forms, such as Bounceman and Snakeman, and create completely new techniques that surprised even the Yonko. However, despite all that, at the end of the day, Gear 4 did have to run out at some point, which was still a problem for Luffy, given that he could not use Haki for about 10 minutes after that. What Luffy managed in Wano was to extend the life of Gear 4 tremendously, and gain the ability to swap between its multiple forms freely without losing the transformation. This was a major step already. But now, Luffy has taken things to another level and achieved the utmost mastered form of Gear 4, which he displayed in Chapter 1129. As was clear to the fans in Chapter 1129, Luffy has now mastered Gear 4 completely. In this chapter, Luffy attempted to use Gear 4 on a wall in order to break it. Usually, the way Luffy goes about it is to pump air into his muscles and inflate his body, coating it with the maximum output of Haki, and then unleashing powerful strikes on his enemies. This gives Luffy a giant bouncy body, which is even taller than that of Doflamingo. However, now Luffy is doing something entirely different. Instead of transforming his entire body into Gear 4, Luffy is essentially only using Gear 4 in one arm. Fans saw this in One Piece Chapter 1129 when Luffy attempted to break a wall, and it was a surprise to many. Luffy only transformed one of his arms into Gear 4 and coated it in Haki. His remaining body remained as it was, and this suggests that Luffy has incredible mastery over the Gomu-Go. Although this might seem like it came out of nowhere to the fans, this is something similar to what happened with Luffy's other gears. For instance, when it comes to the weakness of Gear 3, which was Luffy essentially turning into a chibi version of himself, Oda eventually phased this out with time. This was supposed to signify that Luffy was learning to control his Devil Fruit powers better. But when it comes to exhaustion and shortening of lifespan as a side effect, the gear that was more similar to Gear 4 was Gear 2. When Luffy first utilized Gear 2, he did so at the cost of his own life. This was also confirmed by the Straw Hat Pirates in the Thriller Bark arc, and Luffy essentially utilizing Gear 2 was deemed way too dangerous for him. However, once Luffy returned from the time skip, we saw a completely new version of Gear 2, at least in the manga. Luffy utilized Gear 2 only through select body parts. For instance, when Luffy had to utilize a jet pistol, he simply used Gear 2 in one of his arms and feet to spring and then deliver a powerful blow to the enemies. This allowed Luffy to switch Gear 2 on and off more frequently and only use it in select body parts, avoiding the case of total exhaustion. What Luffy is doing right now with Gear 4 is exactly what he did with Gear 2. Now Luffy is utilizing the power of Gear 4 in select body parts and only when he needs them. This ensures that he maintains his stamina and his Haki at the same time while maintaining incredible firepower that Gear 4 has. Now Luffy doesn't need to fully enter Gear 4 form even if he has to fight a strong opponent. He can use just a single body part to attack. And if we look at it, Luffy can now freely fly for a much longer time in Gear 4 form. Well, the video ends here, but do you know that the government might have a cloned Seraphim of Kaido named S-Dragon? So if you want to know more about this, watch this video. But before leaving, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. We'll meet again with another amazing video. Until then, goodbye.